Today we're going to go over scale, and we're going to briefly touch on the three most popular scales.
This is my house. It's scaled for me. That means people can live in here. These are my cars. They're also scaled for people to use.
This bicycle, for example, isn't scaled for me. I probably could ride it if I really needed to or something, but if you saw me riding this while you were driving to work, you'd probably tell your friends about it. It'd be pretty strange.
It's been a while since my last video. Sorry about that. My family got COVID-19 shortly after I filmed the first draft of this video, and a week after that, the part of Korea I live in got 17 inches of rain in a single day, no less. That's enough rain to fill half a swimming pool. But falling everywhere at once, it caused the wall behind my house to fall down, and some big trees at the top were pretty precariously perched after. So I had to take care of a lot of things. Anyway, I'm back now, and all those things gave me time to think about my video, and the original version of this video was over an hour long. So I decided to simplify and streamline some things. So with that said, let's get into scale. Before you do anything in model railroading, you have to decide on a scale. And before you decide on a scale, you need to know what scale is and what scales are available. So scale is what puts the model into model railroading. Simply put, the scale tells you how many times smaller a model is than its real-world counterpart, the thing being modeled. So when we build a model diorama, we want to be careful that everything in it is the same scale, so that there's nothing that looks the way I do riding this bike. And we want everything to look realistic, or not noticeably strange. So for another example, let's talk about track gauge. So all railroads use a gauge. Most railroads in the United States, South Korea, and lots of other countries, I think about 60% of the railroads in the world, in fact, use something called standard gauge, which is 1,435 millimeters of space between the rails. So from one metal tie to the other, there's 1,435 millimeters of a gap. Now, let's take a look at this model railroad track. It's 9 millimeters wide. So 1,435 divided by 9 equals 159.444444444. Or let's just say 160. So this track is 1/160th the size of real railroad track. This particular track is N-scale track. The N in N-scale comes from the track being 9 millimeters wide. N-scale cars, houses, and people then should all be 1/160th the size of their real-world counterparts. So next, let's talk about the biggest of the three scales I'm going to talk about today, O-scale. O-scale is 1/48th scale. You might expect the track rails to be 1/48th as far apart as the real-world standard gauge railroad track. And you'd be right. The gauge of tracks in O-scale is always 1/48th the size of our standard gauge in the real world. But because O-scale toy trains started being made over 100 years ago and were primarily sold as toys, not models, for much of that time, you're going to find that most O-scale products are not perfectly 1/48th size. In fact, many of the train cars and engines are made closer to 1/64th scale. And that's because smaller train cars mean that more train cars can fit in the same amount of space, which also translates to more sales with less materials. Because of that fact, and because the track gauge is scaled to 1/48th, this scale is often called O gauge instead of O scale. So for the past 2 decades, maybe a little more, O gauge manufacturers have produced true scale products, like as high-end, top-end models. These train engines and cars cost more, but are really excellently detailed, and they are actually O scale 1/48 size. Alright, the last scale we're going to talk about today is HO scale. HO scale fits neatly in the middle of our scales we're talking about today, with O scale at 1/48 and N at 160. Yeah, 187 is right in the middle. So the majority of modelers around the world think HO is a Goldilocks scale. This scale is big enough to have impressive lighting and sound fit inside, while small enough to make a realistic looking model railroad in like a spare bedroom. Outside of these scales, there are larger ones like G scale, which is used for garden railroads outside, and smaller ones like Z scale, which is a tiny 1/220th size. I'm not going to get into those because the three sizes you see here, O gauge, N scale, and HO scale in the middle, are the most popular. And once you step outside of these, you're really going to be hard pressed to find certain things in that scale. Even in N gauge, it's hard for me to find the cars I want. And if you live overseas, like I do, it's really, really hard to find what you want. Alright, so in today's video, we covered the three most popular scales: HO scale, N scale, and O gauge. And of those three, I'm going to be going with N scale. But it's a hard problem, a difficult choice. It took me almost 2 years to choose N scale finally. And part of that was because we moved from an apartment to a house. And once I had my house, I realized I was able to recreate my original N scale layout in HO scale. So it was pretty tempting to just use that extra space to, go up a scale. However, after thinking about it a lot, I realized that in that same space in N scale, I could do a lot more. I could add more features to my railroad. And so in the end, I stuck with N. But what scale do you think is best for you, and why? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. In my next video, I will probably go over my personal journey with my family on how I got to N scale. And I will also probably talk about tips on how to maximize the use of your space, whatever space you want to allot for your railroad. There's a lot of things you can do to make the best use of it. So until then, take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time.